church should give you a award.
Yeah, definitely. Wow.
Who are the two translators? Sorry, I wrote
Julia.
Julia.
Okay. All right, we're going to go live with the meeting. 1 second, please.
Okay.
Recording in progress.
Well, good morning and welcome to those of you here with us today and our board. And for those of you who are joining us online, great to have you with us. We're going to go ahead and call the meeting to order. The meeting will be simultaneously translated into Spanish. We have Leah and Juliet. Leah, would you please give the instructions for those who would like to listen in Spanish?
Hola a todos y bienvenidos. Si desea escuchar la interpretación en español de esta reunión, por favor dé clic en el globo terráqueo que se encuentra en la parte inferior de su pantalla y seleccione la opción de español que aparece.
Thank you, Leah. If you'll join me for the Pledge of Allegiance.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, Josh, could you do a roll call for us this morning?
Yes, sir. Rachel Arizmendi. Present. Don Cameron.
Here.
Janae DaCosta. Present. Mike Gallo. Glenda Humiston. Julia Jackson. Bryce Lundberg. David Mancera. Michelle Passero. Doria Robinson. Joy Sterling.
Present.
Chris Valadez. Mr. President, we have a couple board members that will be arriving late because of traffic.
All right. We will hold off on approval of minutes till we have a quorum, hopefully a little later. So, Secretary, could you do the departmental update for us?
I will be as brief as possible. My month started in a very good way because I got to spend a day with Rochelle in Norco around a really innovative project that actually was a recipient of one of our New Beginning Farmer grants and urban ag. And it was a great day to really see small-scale agriculture in a community that really pulls together to really connect food access and farming in that community. So thank you, Rochelle, for that invitation and for spending the whole day with me and making sure I got back to the airport in time. It was a really, really, really good day. And it's fun to see these projects up and down the state and start to identify where our gaps are as we really look forward to improving the resiliency of our food systems. The following week, I had the pleasure at the very last minute of being invited to join the governor in a bilateral meeting with the Prime Minister from New Zealand, who was on his way back home from the NATO summit in Washington, D.C. It was a very good meeting. Like all of our friends in New Zealand, it's just so easy to strike up conversations and find all the commonalities and some of the approaches that folks are considering. A lot of conversation about climate and especially about enteric fermentation, because for their pasture-raised livestock, it's a big part of their total oil emissions. So we had a lot to talk about, and the summit that we did earlier this year, the scientific summit on methane reduction in livestock, there were at least 10 people, including the General Counsel's office, that were represented at that summit. So it was really nice to be able to make those connections with the newly elected leader of their government in New Zealand. I did a quick trip to Washington, D.C. earlier this month to do a day-long meeting with our friends at the Food and Drug Administration around all of our food safety and especially the produce safety rules that we're all involved in. I will say that the Assistant Administrator, Jim Jones, is really starting to hit his stride on some of the reorganization, and there's a number of new positions that are being posted due to retirements, and the reorganization and the new leadership that they're bringing in is really constructive, collaborative, and the kinds of partners we need at the federal level. I also had a chance to go and spend some time with Undersecretary Robert Bonney, and I also got a few minutes with Undersecretary Alexis Taylor, as well as Undersecretary Jenny Lester Moffitt. So it was nice to connect with friends from across the country like that. And then a couple of weeks ago, we did probably one of the first full-day meetings with our CEOs of the marketing orders and commissions. We used to do those about once a year, and then COVID kind of disrupted that, and we got into the habit of doing them virtually. It was a really good day to be together, to hear what's going on, because it's not an easy time in agriculture. Everyone's feeling some of the same things, but many of the things that are different. It was also an inspiring day because of the other half of the day was with California Grown, which, because of some of the relief dollars from USDA and some specialty crop block grant funding that was made available in addition to the traditional allocation, we have launched 2 new campaigns. One is The Sound of Good, and if it doesn't put a smile on your face, nothing will, but it's all about what makes California agriculture so special and so tasty, and the joy that it can bring into eating pleasures at the table. And the other one is really centered around agritourism, which is still a fast-growing sector of tourism in California. Visit California announced earlier this year that their numbers are back to pre-COVID levels. They're still lagging a bit in rural communities. Yesterday, I had a briefing with the specialists for agritourism through UC Ag and Natural Resources on some new reports that they're doing, and there's so many opportunities as small-scale and mid-sized farmers are looking for anything that will supplement the revenues from farming. And agritourism, although we don't have an official state definition, I see one in our future. It starts with being an active farm. And of course, that brings with it all the issues associated with bringing outsiders onto an active farm, potential liability issues, but it is a hugely important way of connecting with consumers. Agritourism really exploded during COVID because it was an outdoor family-centric event that could happen in people's backyards. And I just see that growth trend of being able to continue. So those were the fun things we've been involved in, but I do want to also report that I hate to talk about this too publicly, but we are down to 1 quarantine for the Oriental fruit fly. We have shrunk that quarantine. It's where the hotbed infestation was. We have another part of the life cycle to go through. But talk about a tribute to collaboration, local, state, federal government, with the citizens of those communities, with the grower community, with the nurseries. It all worked. But we know that our pest seasons are changing, and they're visiting more often, and they're staying longer. And so the preventive work that we do with our border stations, with our trapping programs, have to continue. But I'm very grateful to the governor and the legislature for the additional funding they made available to make sure we could bring this particular one to conclusion. And I will also report that as of today, we still have no high-path AI, which probably we should not call it avian influenza anymore, in dairies. The numbers of herds that have been positively identified nationwide have also plateaued out. So the milk supply is safe, pasteurization works. We are working very carefully with our dairy sector on biosecurity. And I thought I'd end with those 2 positive reports and say thank you to the CDFA staff for what they're doing. It'll be even more important with the budget cuts that we have to start preparing for.
Thank you, Secretary. Yeah, that is really amazing from where we were a year ago to where we are now with the fruit fly infestations. I mean, be honest with you, they were running kind of rampant in some areas
Yes.
in Southern California, and to see that come under control really is a testament to the cooperation between the state and the federal groups getting this funded and getting it under control. So thank you.
Yeah.
Also like to thank Janae for bringing in some wonderful California berries for us today. It's a real treat that really is wonderful to have. So thank you. Appreciate that. All right, we are going to kind of take a snapshot of where California agriculture is at this time in 2024. We know that there's been a lot of stress in different segments, and we're going to try and give everybody a good overview of really what's going on the ground within California today. So we're going to start this with the 2024 Trends Report, Agricultural Land and Lease Values. We have with us Jenny Gatzman and Scott Bozo, both from the California chapter of the American Society of Farm Managers and Rural Appraisers. Janie is an accredited rural appraiser with deep roots in the local ag community. Janie began her appraisal career with American Ag Credit, the 6th largest farm credit association in the U.S., and after 13 years, opened Gatzman Appraisal in 2017, focusing on ag real property appraisal and consulting. Scott is the president and founder of Macotera Ag Group, a full-service agricultural asset management, advisory, brokerage, and consulting firm. So welcome. Good to have you both here with us today, and look forward to your reports.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here and an honor to be presenting to you. So thank you for the invite. I'm also the president of the California chapter.
You might have to hold the mic closer.
Sorry.
Actually, sorry.
Get it closer. I'm the president of the California chapter, American Society of Farm Managers and Rural Appraisers. And I like to tell people I'm also a 4th generation almond farmer and processor from the Ripon and Oakdale areas. And my husband and I are raising the 5th generation in Oakdale. So family farming isn't dead in California, no matter what you've heard. It may take some off-farm income, and that's what I represent as the appraiser, but it works out well. Get into our presentation here. We have a quick little disclaimer. We tell everybody, don't use this publication to appraise your property. There are always going to be properties that don't fall into this value range that you see in here. Use an accredited appraiser to appraise your property. There are always specific factors that are present on every property that you need an appraiser to evaluate. I also want to quickly tell you about how we develop the value ranges in our publication. Anyone can go on county data and see what the reports are of sales that have happened in counties all over California. But what that doesn't tell you is which sales are market and which sales are not, which sales are intrafamily, only had a percentage interest being transferred, or were subject to a lease, or even were subject to a court order or something like that. County data doesn't tell you that. It also doesn't tell you how much of that value is allocated to a large house or a processing facility or a big barn. So what we do is we have appraisers go in and confirm those sales, allocate them according to how we're taught in the American Society of Farm Managers and Rural Appraisers. And then we have a data range showing the actual distilled value for each of the commodity and water areas in California. So that's what our publication represents, and it's different from some of the other publications out there. We're very proud of it. And we can advance a couple of slides. Thanks. I just finished that one. Thank you. All right. Making of Trends, we have a coordinating team for Trends that includes Todd Combs, Josh Mendrin, Scott Bozo, who's here today, and Matan Goldberg. And we have professionals all over the state of California who are involved in the making of trends every year. So it's not a one-person or a two-person job. It's a collective effort from our entire chapter. Thank you. And Scott's going to take over about talking about wine grapes.
Yeah, thank you. The kind of high level we wanted to touch on, as you guys look at the booklet and look at some of these slides, you'll see commodities have different cycles and you'll see ups and downs. And so what we really want to try to point out throughout this presentation is while the data we get from trends does say 2023 on it, the market's substantially different. And so we wanted to give you guys not only a look at what the booklet says, but really what's going on today. So it's going to give you a good snapshot of where we are. So when you think about the different commodities and where we're at in different cycles, this first slide touches on premium wine grapes. That would be mostly in the Central Coast and in Napa and Sonoma. Those values and ranges have been holding steady, but that doesn't mean that they're not subject to the pressures of inflation and other things that are pushing on margin. And when you think about in these areas, you typically see long-term vineyard contracts that a winery will put together, and you haven't quite gotten to the level of softening in values. You're starting to see wineries sell large vineyards, and you're starting to see investment groups and other large growers put vineyards on the market. So while this data right now looks flat, looking into the future, especially after harvest, we suspect that buyers and sellers will have to start making different decisions, and we're going to start seeing some softening. So while these values today show you increased and or plateaued values, I mean, let's be honest, Napa is like adult Disneyland, right? It's not really a place that has normal vineyard economics that we see in the rest of the state. So just wanted to make sure that everyone kind of understands, especially in that market segment, where it is in the commodity cycle. Next slide, please. So as we flip, we stay in the vineyard wine grape sector, but we're going to go into more northern Central Valley, Lodi, and into the Central Valley, Madera, and Fresno counties. You can see from these slides us starting to see a drop in value, and mostly that's attributed to the factors of wine grape pricing really decreased in 2023. And it's no secret that commodity prices drive land values, right? And so you're starting to see that this segment of the market is maybe just 1 year ahead of where the Central Coast and North Coast would be. Janie and I were talking about these slides earlier, and you might be able to see the difference in the downward trajectory of these two slides. And if you look at the Fresno Madera, you might say, well, maybe there wasn't so much of a drop, but really those vineyards were selling almost at open land values today. There wasn't as big of a premium put on the improvement value above open land. So it's a different market than Napa and Sonoma, and these slides certainly show that, and they certainly show where you're at in the commodity cycle. The other thing that would support the values in this section would be you typically have other commodities, almonds, pistachios, walnuts, that maybe be able to buffer the values and keep them stronger. And as you'll see later, those markets aren't as strong to kind of give you that safety net.
All right, next slide. Yeah, almond orchards in the San Joaquin Valley. Here you'll see we've had really strong prices the last five or so years, and that's really a result of cheap money, low interest rates. Low interest rates inflate asset values, and that's definitely what we've seen in the state over the last 5 years. That is we're having a reckoning now because we've had lower commodity prices for the last few years. We've had somewhat of an overproduction in the almond industry particularly, but all the nut crops and many of other crops for the last 3 years. COVID blunted that a little bit and hid the problem, but it's all coming to roost right now. And even though almonds and some of the other nut crops, the commodity price is showing a little positive news right now, we haven't started harvest yet. We have a very large almond crop to be harvested. And interest rates, even if they do fall a little bit, we're not going to get back to that almost free money stage that we used to be at. So there's going to be continued softness in this market for quite a while. We need to get back off of those unsustainable highs that we were at. We need to lose some acreage as well. You do see in the slides in the north part of the San Joaquin Valley, we have some of the most secure and inexpensive water supplies, so that's why those values were the highest. They did fall quite a long way so far in 2024, but if you look at that dark green graph in the north slide, you're still, the high point of that range in 2024 is still at 40,000 acre or above. I've seen multiple sales at that level, and you're not going to find those levels anywhere else in the state for almond orchards that are producing. That is still a very wide value range. We go as low as $25,000 an acre in the best water areas in the northern San Joaquin Valley. And when we get into federal water or wells only, we've seen a much larger decrease, and that's going to be maintained for a long time. Central and south, same story. The stronger water areas are going to have the smaller declines in value. The areas that are well only have declined a lot more, and the low end of that range is probably where a lot of those sales are at right now. Next slide. For pistachios, it's a very similar story. The overproduction in the pistachio industry was felt more last year, for the first time last year, and that crop did get sold pretty well. So the prices are fairly positive right now, but there is a real glut of new plantings in pistachios that are going to bring very large crops in the next 10 years. So that's still a challenge on the horizon for the pistachio orchards. There are a lot of listings right now, not a whole lot of sales in pistachios, and the very large value range you're seeing is the difference between secure, stable water supplies at fairly low costs, and then on the low end, what we call the white areas, the areas that are well only, and for pistachios, in a lot of areas where there are significant pumping restrictions due to SGMA. So we're seeing values below $10,000 an acre for orchards in those areas. There's probably not a lot of orchard sales in the very middle of that value range, so we'll probably start splitting that value range here in the next few years.
So the next slide here, we're looking at walnut orchards and thinking back to what we talked about earlier, where we are in a commodity cycle. Walnuts are probably the most advanced, and they've had multi-year low pricing, and that's really impacted value. So you see steep drops in a lot of regions, and the main reason that you see Sacramento with a bigger drop there is a lot of it is around adaptability to other plantings, right? And in that region, you don't have necessarily a large other commodities like cherries or other permanent crops that might be able to go where those walnuts might be. But in looking at the data, when you have multiple years back to back of below income or below break even pricing, the orchards just don't have a lot of value now, and so I don't want to joke, but we've said it before that just about every walnut orchard is for sale today in California. It's not really a secret. It's just the reality of the economics. And when you get someone that wants to buy, they're typically making a bid, sometimes even below open land values, and that is to factor in the cost to remove the trees, right, and plant something else. Maybe they're putting it into tomatoes, or maybe they're in Sacramento going back into rice or something different, right? So it's a difficult market to be in, and by far it's the most advanced when you look at where the commodity cycles have been. And while pricing is better this year than what it was, it's still low, and that's impacting operations, and don't really see a change for that, especially after this harvest. But yeah, it's a difficult segment of the market for sure. Next slide. Sacramento Valley, this is cropland, so this is focusing mostly on open land values. Back in 2022, we obviously had the drought that all of us here in this room remember, but that did lead to increased rice pricing, and that did buoy and keep land values up in that region. Last year, the saving grace was the tomato price. Dawn and I were talking about that earlier before the meeting started, and it's really kept values up in that region. I don't know what's going to be the saving grace this year. We're all kind of looking around trying to figure out what that might be. But I do see that, Sacramento will always have a strong value because of the water. And they do have a large, diverse crop base. They can grow safflower, right? They can grow rice. They can do tomatoes. They can do a lot of different things that really keeps open land values there strong. But still, the softening is starting to creep through, and that's due to, once again, nut crops, mostly walnuts and almonds, aren't holding the weight, pushing the values up like we have seen historically. So when you look at the graphs and the values, you can start to see a little bit of weakening there too.
All right, moving on to the northern San Joaquin Valley cropland values. We see a little more softness there than we did in the Sacramento Valley, and that's just because those markets were a little more overheated because of the stronger permanent plantings and variety of permanent plantings that were available there. And all of those have not been profitable now for a few years, so that pressure is gone. We're still looking at what are good alternatives there. Open land is going to be leased out usually for row crops of some sort, maybe sweet potatoes in Merced, maybe strawberry plants in the Modesto and Ripon areas. But they're just looking for what might be profitable right now. You're not seeing these converted into orchards and vineyards much right now. The areas with the strongest water supplies, the most reliable and the least expensive, are the ones holding their values the most. The ones that are reliant on federal or well water are the ones holding the value the least. Next slide. And it's really the same story in the central San Joaquin Valley. This is Fresno and Madera counties, and I like that we've been able to really show the difference between district water and well water in these areas over time. When SGMA became law, you can see that those values really started to change. Well-only areas started to significantly decline when that became law in 2014, 2015. And then in drought times, that value difference maintained very strongly. Districts went up a lot the last few years as SGMA restrictions started kicking in, and everything's kind of softening right now, but the well-only areas are going to soften the most. And finally, we have the southern San Joaquin Valley. This is where the SGMA pumping restrictions are probably the most mature. So we see values on the low end of that value range in 2024, probably below $5,000 an acre in the most water insecure areas. And in Kern County, that's going to be state water and well-only areas. Kings County, it's the west areas and well-only. The Kern River Delta in Kern has the best water supplies, and we've seen values really stay somewhat stable at the top end of that range this year so far. But the low end of the range has had some really significant declines. And Tulare County, it's the same story. The well-only areas are right there around $5,000 an acre, and the more secure water supplies are maybe a little bit over $20,000 an acre, but that has shown softness as well. So we have really a similar story all over the state, and I hope we've been able to show you the differences from 2023 to 2024. There's been a significant difference, and it's been felt in every commodity in every area of California. That doesn't happen very often in California, so it is somewhat of a historical time that we're living through.
One thing I wanted to quickly point out with our report is we added in a tiered system for water districts, and in those of you who are familiar with our trends report, we added that in this year. It mostly focuses on the Central Valley. Those of you who don't have access to the report, the website, you can purchase it through. You can get a digital copy or the more standard magazine form that we have here. So that's interesting. That's something that we added new this year. We're very, very proud of it. And I think the best thing that this report does is it highlights the diversity that we have in California agriculture that everyone in this room is aware of. So you saw that last slide that Janie had that went all the way down to $5,000 an acre, and the first one was Napa up, above $500,000 an acre sometimes, right? So it is the
It's
wonderful
California.
thing about California. So once again, thanks you guys for having us.
Thank you. Really appreciate your report. We're going to go open it up to questions. Go ahead, Secretary.
I have two. One is for our friends from the coastal areas. We didn't touch on berries and vegetable crops. It seems more stable, but just wanted to know if you had a comment on that. And then my other question is coming back to this dramatic potential landscape change that we're going to see. Everyone's struggling with the right siting for renewable energy, whether it's wind, but especially solar. But this confluence of water, continued agricultural productivity for food security, land use, that's all coming together now with energy. Do you see at some point you trying to capture what that actually does to land values from the landowners, like this is an asset, I have to generate something. We're trying to understand community impacts, what that means for different kinds of jobs, but not the annual planting, purchasing of inputs, all those other businesses that depend on agriculture. Sorry for a convoluted question, but it's very fundamental to what the Valley in particular will look like even over the next decade. So first I want to acknowledge that we have Central Coast agriculture, and that's an important part of the value scheme as well. Thanks.
Yeah, you want to do dairies and I'll do Central Coast?
You do Central Coast, yeah.
Okay.
And explain why we left it out. I'm
Yeah.
sorry. We
So-
had a short presentation.
we had a short presentation. The main thing is there is a large section in the Trends publication that talks about that. Overall, in the Central Coast, vegetables have done well this year, and so we see operators doing well. Don and I were joking about that earlier too. That Salinas Valley mostly is the king, and there's other portions all the way down to Oxnard, right? And so the Central Coast has done well in the vegetable market. Berries have done okay, but it's not nearly a bloodbath that we've seen in prior years. And so we feel strongly that value should hold in those areas. Where you will see some potential weakening is going to be if the Central Coast wine grape market that we've talked about softening and hurting. There could be a lot of vineyards that come out and production, and if that happens and that turns into vegetable land, obviously the more supply you have, you're going to potentially lead to lower pricing or maybe even lower rents if there's a lot more land available for sale or for lease. So that segment of the market is definitely holding, but remains to be seen how that plays out.
And then when it comes to alternative and energy, I'm going to zero in on solar and zero in on Kern County because that's Kern County and western Fresno County. That's where we're seeing probably the large-scale development of these facilities most often. And I would say that those are going in on farmland that is already being retired, usually due to SGMA, and somewhat due to surface water supply constraints that are long-term and not going to change anytime soon. So that land's being retired anyway. We're not going to have continued ag labor and continued ag inputs on that land anyway. If we can do something with it to help the farmers, to help save some of their value in that land, that's a positive thing. But it's not going to have the ongoing positive impact on the local labor market and the local taxes, everything that ag did. So I see the solar coming in and all of the other wind energy and everything else as probably positive. It can help farmers a bit, but it's not going to help the rural communities as much as continued farming would.
The other thing is it changes the dynamic of how to value that land. I have two different clients with the same issue, one all the way up in Sacramento and one down in Kern County, and it becomes a function of basically you're getting a lease payment in some cases from the solar company, right? And so you're not growing any sort of product anymore. You're just farming the sun, for lack of a better term, right? And so who becomes your buyer at that point? These are what groups really think about. Is there a buyer out there for a steady stream of income? Well, sure there is. In any sort of investment, there's going to be. And if that helps a farmer look at it and say, well, my options are to potentially lose money, or I don't want to put up the investment of a permanent crop that might be very expensive, maybe solar is the right option. You have challenges though in getting it permitted, the time that it takes to get it over the finish line. But if you have areas that are stressed for water, certainly it could be an alternative use. But as far as the local economy, I'll echo what Janie said. I don't see a huge impact because you have someone with boots on the ground that's going to be, on a farm that's going to be needing to do, whether it's a dairy or an almond orchard or a tomato farmer, whatever it might be, right? So that segment of the market will get impacted for sure.
Go ahead, Janae.
Thank you. I have a question. As we're looking at the county climate action plans and looking at marginal lands that might be going into conservation, in some of those areas, are those prices reflected as what is actually market in those types of instances?
Well, I think the biggest problem with something like that is maybe like a checkerboard effect, right? Where if you could have a large segment where you had multiple landowners that were willing to change the land use, yes, that would develop a different market. But I think all of the sales that we grab, I don't think they necessarily dictate what the future land use might be. I don't know if you have a different thought, but I think in the grand scheme of things, the hardest thing to do is you're going to have a very checkerboarded looking landscape where especially areas with tougher water, there might be some that do solar or might do some sort of environmental thing on it as well.
The farmland conservation easements that go on property, I would say don't impact value so much to the bottom end of the range. Now, if it's a environmental conservation easement that limits the type of farming on the property, that can impact it more. But those usually are limiting permanent planning development. There's not pressure for that right now. So in 2024, I would say that probably is not going to impact value.
I've got a question for you. I want to circle back to solar for a minute because we're seeing, as you mentioned, a lot of solar going in Fresno County, and I'm sure down in Kern. But you spoke to maybe a farmer, I think, developing his own solar facility, where what we're seeing is large-scale companies coming in, because I think you're looking at least 175 million and plus permitting to put a section of solar on ground, and I don't see too many growers actually wanting to take that risk, but we are seeing long-term leases at a fixed rate plus an escalator. So how do you look at that as far as land value? Long-term, just kind of curious. I mean, this ground is probably can be or could be out of production with Sigma. And so the grower, I think, looks at it as another income stream as he would a crop. Just curious.
Absolutely, especially in Fresno County, I've seen on many operations, it's getting a solar company to come in and start a lease and develop a facility has been the difference between some farms going bankrupt there and some farms continuing. So it has been a positive thing. As an appraiser, the way I look at it is to value that portion of the land is just valuing the current value of a future income stream, which is the way I would value any long-term leased agricultural property. So it could be an almond orchard that has a 25-year lease. I would value it the same way as a solar lease. You are certain on your income stream for 20 years, 30 years, 50 years, however long they're doing these. So you just look at rates of return, and they're actually fairly simple to value. And we don't have to worry about changing water supplies and all of the other policy things that affect land values in that case, though I'm sure there are other policy things that will happen with energy that will impact it down the road. I don't know if that will change the leases, so it does look like a more certain income stream, which is fairly easy to value.
Yeah, and when I had clients that have looked at those types of things, Don, it's that exact question, and in a lot of cases, it's easier to predict what a land value might be if it's grown for crops, but the solar thing is still a bit unknown, and you don't know, and it could be impacted by a lot of things out of your control. One of the big ones would be interest rates, right? So if you're getting a certain rate of return for that open land for rent to a tomato grower, he might be willing to pay you more per acre based on what tomato prices are doing versus what the lease payment might be for solar. And so when I've looked at that through with my clients, we try to think through also, okay, who's going to buy this? Because we're fundamentally changing what this property is. It's not going to be farmland anymore. It's solar. And are you going to get the capital appreciation that you get with long-term ownership of farmland? Because really what you're buying is what Janie just said, is a coupon payment, as a stream of income over the course of owning the piece of land, which you should get, hopefully, with farming also, but you also get the land appreciation with it too. Will that come with solar? I mean, it's not going to be based on almond prices or tomato prices. It's going to be probably based on something like interest rates, right? So it's a tough one to really think through.
Interesting. And your prediction for prices at the end of the year? Just kind of curious.
You're trying to be tricky.
No, the only reason I say that is, we've heard from many people throughout California that land prices have kept them out of farming, that land access has been an issue, and, we're definitely, in a pretty substantial valley for land prices currently, and, this year is probably not going to help that. And I had someone ask me at a almond meeting, why aren't, this was about a year and a half ago, when are almond prices going to come down to where I can buy some additional ground? And with every problem, there tends to be an opportunity for somebody, and just wondered what you thought.
Well, I'll work on a gross generalization for that. If the orchards or vineyards that you're looking at, probably more orchards, have a stable and inexpensive supply of water, they may have hit bottom already, and they may be stable towards the end of the year. If they don't, if they're in a well-only area, whether or not there are pumping restrictions, it doesn't matter. They have not hit bottom yet. They're going to continue to fall through the end of the year.
All right.
And does that give opportunity? I'm a young farmer, even though I'm in my 40s.
You're young.
And it's very expensive to buy land. My husband and I lease more than we own. We talked about that earlier. That's a way for young people to get into it. Our values in the good district areas where we're farming low enough for us to buy orchards? Not yet. And I don't know that they will be anytime soon.
I think this is a segue to our next speaker,
I agree.
because there's no way you can assign like the market for this output from this orchard is this. But I think when you talk about the disruptions of COVID, but especially supply chain and what happened to some of our most robust export markets, a friend of mine who's an ag economist at UC Davis sent me some tables where he's slicing and dicing a lot of data and just showing like percent of crop productivity that goes into export markets, and almonds are at the very, very top of that, and there's no way of factoring in continued export markets. Like, you can only deal with like the real tangibles that you're looking at. Yeah, the rest of it
Don,
is
so just
our
tell
banking
us,
friends, I think.
Don, tell us what happened with the election, with trade policy and
Well-
everything else, and that'll help.
I will just make a
Understood.
plea, which I've been making to all kinds of audiences for the past few years, is we all have to work together to change the attitude on trade, because it is about filling the gaps of food security and being able to have this kind of free trade. I call it free and fair trade is critically important for a lot of reasons that maybe don't get accounted as much as they should. So I'll just say that for nutrition security.
And we know that the U.S. government is actually funding to look for new markets for the products we grow here, which is definitely critical long term. So thank you both. Great presentations, and really appreciate you kind of putting it out there for us. Yeah, I always look forward to this as well. So always good to see a good third-party perspective and kind of bring us up to date on different areas throughout the state. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Oh, public comment, hang on. Sorry, I apologize. If you'd like to make public comment on this agenda item, raise your hand icon. Yeah, or if you're here, you may step to the podium.
Yes, if you'd like to make public comment on this agenda item, please use your hand icon and I'll unmute your line. I'm seeing no public comment at this time.
I appreciate that. And thank you again. Good to have you here. Good to get caught up.
Thank
Yep,
you.
thank you, guys. Thank you.
All right, we're going to move to our next presentation. We have agricultural market and land trends. We have David Magana with Rabobank and Joel Kimshu from Land IQ. Welcome to both of you. David is a senior analyst for horticulture and Rabo Research. David is responsible for covering and analyzing the U.S. and North America fresh fruit and vegetable industries. Prior to joining Rabobank, David served as Deputy Director of Economic Research for FIRA, Banco de Mexico, one of the most important agricultural banks in Latin America. Joel is a founding partner and principal soil and agricultural scientist with Land IQ. The company specializes in providing solutions to challenging agricultural and environmental problems in California and throughout the world. Expertise includes soil science, water quality and demand management, agricultural systems, and geospatial analysis, among others. Welcome to our meeting today. Good to have both of you with us.
Thank you.
So,
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. When I was invited, they asked me to present about agricultural markets and lending considerations. So one question that is in everybody's mind is what the cost of money is going to be like in the next few months or years. And so I'm not claiming that I have the crystal ball, but I will be discussing a few of the moving pieces that will determine the interest rates in the next few months and in the next year or so. So if we move to the next slide, please. So when I was preparing this last week, I was planning to show the interest rates and how you can blame your kids or younger generations to keep these interest rates higher for longer. And then at the beginning of this week, we had a lot of surprises in international markets. The Bank of Japan increasing their interest rates for the first time in many years. And then combined with the data for jobs in last Friday. So that was not a good combination, and that is moving the markets. So, but longer term, let's look at the more like longer term. And here we have the federal funds effective rate for the past 40 years. Obviously, it's been, we all been feeling the impacts of persistent elevated inflation over the past 3 years. And 2 years ago still, the question was, is this inflationary episode gonna be transitory or not? Now we know the answer, it was not. But putting things in perspective, 40 years ago when we had a similar level of inflation, interest rates were almost 4 times higher. So, so now interest rates seem to be high, but if you look over the past 40 years, now they are close to historical averages. So what was unusual was to have very inexpensive money for a long period of time. And many are expecting, oh, I want money to go, interest rates to go back to zero. But just keep in mind that it's not everything about interest rates. Because when we see interest rates dropping to close to zero, that means that we have some not so favorable conditions, right? So basically, when we've seen that happen is because we either have black swan events or gray rhino events. If you don't know the difference, the first is unpredictable event that has severe consequences, such as 9/11 or the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, the oil crisis 2014, Brexit, things like that. Whereas the gray rhino is a predictable event that you see it coming, but you decide to ignore, minimize, or neglect. And that includes geopolitics, monetary policy of central banks, and also the adoption of new technologies, things like that. So when we've seen interest rates dropping to zero is because we see a lot of these very unusual events, and the interest rates need to go back to very low levels. So now, what a lot of economists have been predicting, and granted, we don't have a good track record over the past few years. Economists are good at predicting recessions. We just don't know when those are gonna happen. So they've been predicting a recession by the end of 21, probably the second half of 22, then probably by the end of 23, and now they say probably we're approaching a recession. So the answer is we still don't know, and the same goes with interest rates. 2 years ago, the prediction was interest rates are gonna go probably 3.5, and then gonna start declining. Then probably gonna go to 4, 4.5, 5. 2 years later, we're still higher than 5, and still will still be higher for longer. And then, obviously, the persistent inflation and the surprising consumer expenditure that is being surprising a lot of people, including economists, and that I will be explaining in the second part of my presentation, how you can blame the newer generations for expending probably too much, and now keeping this expenditure robust and avoiding inflation to come down and interest rates also to come down. So in the next slide, we will see, obviously the Fed is looking at this, always looking at the balance between inflation and the job market. The job market, we are expecting that to remain slow to rise, despite the number that we saw last week. So by the end of this year, our macroeconomists are expecting still inflation to remain above 3% and unemployment below 5%. So with that combination of factors, the Fed is expecting not to be in a hurry. Unlike we see some black swan or something like that, nobody wants that to happen. So there are not a lot of incentives to aggressively cut interest rates in the next few months. In the next slide, I will see, and I will show off, if you want to use that term, how our macroeconomists have been correct in their expectations about the interest rate. So we have here the SOFR futures for the past couple of years. So the yellow line is Rabobank expectations, and then you see in the blue line what the market has been expecting by the end of 2024. So a few months ago, still the market was expecting 6, 7, or even 8 rate cuts by the end of 2024. We haven't seen a single one, and we're expecting just to see probably one in the next meeting probably. So still higher for longer interest rates. Probably one cut is what our macroeconomists are expecting by the end of 24. And depending on how the things evolve, probably 1 or max 2 cuts in 2025. So that's that could be the balance. So in the next slide, so some of the factors that have been impacting this persistent inflation and the resilient consumer expenditure is being 2 factors. So first, real wage growth is in positive territory again. So if you look inflation and also wage growth, Now in 2024, that is in positive territory again. Also, seems like travel and entertainment are priorities. So we see that travel continues to recover. So here we have, for the past few years, a positive trend in travel and entertainment expenditure. And now this is driven by the YOLO economy. So the YOLO economy is that you only live once philosophy. So you better spend now. And particularly newer generations, that is quite a trend. But not everyone is doing the same. So over the past few years, consumers have been trying to adapt to this persistent inflation. And we see how some consumers have been adapting. So some of that is channel shifting, trading down, or even trading out. And also here in this slide, we see some strategies by supermarkets. And I have some numbers regarding the channel shifting that has obvious marketing implications for agricultural producers and agricultural marketers. And then in the next slide, now we see for 2022, 2023, and now the first half of 24, we've seen this consistent trend of consumers searching for value. So if you see the in-store transactions for discount grocers have been increasing particularly fast in 22 in this one, and in the next slide, we see what happened in 24. So around 10% year-on-year increase in transaction for these discount grocers, and also warehouse clubs have been also benefiting for consumers searching for this value. So we see shoppers continue to adjust to financial pressures. So now we've seen even some new terminology has been appearing. In the next slide, we see a report by the National Bureau of Economic Research. And we have here a new term, is called cheapflation, which means that if you look at, they are separating, when you go to buy groceries, they are dividing by quarter. So the most expensive items and the least expensive, and see how the changes in prices have been behaving. Given that consumers have been trading down, so the demand for more affordable food items has been increasing. So the prices for the most affordable food items has been growing faster. So that is what they call cheapflation. So it's an additional 8 to 10 percentage points faster, the most affordable compared to the most expensive. And that is not only happening in the US, but globally, also in some European markets. So this is quite interesting how the consumers trading down is already impacting also the price of food and the relative price of food, the more affordable and also relative to the most expensive. So everything is getting more expensive, but the most affordable foods are increasing the fastest. So, but still, even in this environment, we see that for some food items, for example, the fresh fruit and vegetable aisle, now it seems like a healthy alternative for US consumers. Here you see that even in June this year, we saw a deflation in the fresh produce aisle. And here I know it's a lot of data right there, but we see some of the elements declining in prices compared to the prices a year ago. Particularly, you see there apples and potatoes. And here I just want to mention one phenomenon. If you see apple prices to the consumers have been declining 10, 12% year on year, but grower prices have been declining way faster than that. Similar to potatoes. Potatoes are now at a lower price to the consumer compared to a year ago, but growers have been getting probably half of the price that they were getting a year ago. So this is another example of asymmetric price transmission that we see that the movement in prices that ag growers are getting is not transmitted in the same magnitude to consumers. And we saw that in tree nuts over the past few years, where we saw historical minimum prices for almonds, walnuts. And when you go to the retail, to the supermarket, you don't see necessarily lower prices. So then they wonder, how are we going to foster demand if we don't see any change in prices? So just another example of asymmetric price transmission. So moving on, another piece of the puzzle is obviously exchange rates. Now, the dollar has been quite strong over the past few months against a lot of currencies. The exception has been the Mexican peso. And one driver of this is the difference in interest rates. If you thought that the interest rates in the US were rising fast, in Mexico, they were rising even faster. So the spread was, 3 years ago, was 300 basis points. At one point was more than 600 basis points. So that has been attracting investment to Mexico. But now, with the recent movements, we see that now Mexican peso has been depreciating over the past few days, and we'll see how that plays out. In the meantime, Mexico has been, the favorable exchange rate for US exports to Mexico has been driving exports, particularly dairy products, apples, and other things like that. And to conclude my presentation, in the next slide, I will just show what I promised to talk about, how the new consumers of newer generations, they have been really influencing consumption, inflation, and then eventually interest rate, the decision of interest rates. So here is just a slide. It's a busy slide, but I just want to highlight a couple of things. Millennials, and this is the only thing that I will say about millennials. I will pick on centennials after. So they are willing to spend money to save time, and they are willing to spend money on experiences better than commodities, right? So now that is really fostering this YOLO economy and the willingness to spend on experiences rather than things, including even housing. In the next slide, we see now that the housing market has been really challenging for these newer consumers. And we see the relationship in the next slide between house prices and interest rates. Usually you see that negative relationship. When interest rates go up, house prices used to come down, but that was not the case in this economic cycle. So high interest rates and house prices continue to be elevated. So now this is the most unaffordable housing market in US history. So that is changing consumer behavior, because some of these younger consumers, they say, if I'm not gonna be able to afford a house, why do I save money? I'd rather spend it now. And if you consider the proportion of families that own the house, probably some of them think, if my parents, I'm gonna inherit the house from my parents, why do I have to save? So anyway, and I'm not making this up, in the next slide, I'm showing some of the dynamics in spending among, that is quite strong among younger consumers. In the left panel, you see the consumer retail spending by income, and that is quite similar if you see over the past 2 or a couple of years. So there is no significant distinction between consumer retail spending by income. But when you look at retail spending by age, then you see that younger consumers are really spending 20% year-on-year increase over the past 2 or 3 years, a consistent 20% increase. So that is when they refer to this resilient consumer expenditure, a lot of that is coming from this. So in the next slide, just showing how the younger generations are the most ethnically diverse in the US. and adapting to those that more diverse tastes and preferences is going to determine the future of food demand. So I will leave it like that. And the not so good news in the next slide, a lot of that expenditure is being on credit card debt. So you see right there, even by consumers, credit card delinquencies is on the rise, and that is now impacting consumer confidence. In the last couple of slides, because I know that my time is up, and I had 100 more slides, but I will present those in another occasion. So this is the typical cycle in some crop. Row crop, row crops. So you see that obviously there are some dynamics that are favorable now, particularly lower input prices compared to the very elevated levels in 2022. But now you see, depending on the industry that you look at, still some profitability challenges, things like that, and this is just the general economic cycle. Now, in the next slide, you see how the fertilizer prices and some chemistry prices, after they increased 3x in 2022, they are kind of coming back to pre-Russia-Ukraine situation levels and are expected to remain at similar levels for the next year. However, if you see, obviously, the cost of borrowing is expected to be higher for longer. For how long or how much? The next is my last slide, and I can use it as my excuse slide. This is based on the famous dot plot chart by decision makers. If you see, some decision makers are expecting still no rate cuts by mid 2025. At least one is thinking probably not rate cuts, and the other one is expecting to go all the way to 3.5. So somewhere in the middle is going to happen. So that two things that I wanted to highlight is one is the very diverse expectations, and the other is nobody is expecting interest rates to go back to zero. So probably the minimum for this monetary policy cycle is going to be 3.5 or probably 3%, and then we'll go from there. So again, unless we see a black swan that probably nobody wants, we will not see our interest rates go back to the levels that we were seeing for a long period of time recently. So, but as I said, not everything is about the interest rate level. There are a lot of moving pieces, and I know that the rest of the presenters here are going to be discussing specific industry dynamics, and many of them are moving in the right direction. So with that, I will appreciate your attention.
Thank you, David.
We have to wait to ask him questions, huh?
Yes, we have to wait.
All right.
Well, welcome. Good.
No, you're good. You're good. I can do this in 5 minutes or 50, doesn't matter. Secretary Ross, Chair Cameron, board members, thank you for having me here today. I appreciate the opportunity to present some work that we've been doing in land use classification. This is the cover slide, so you can go to the next slide. So, okay, sorry. So just one slide on who we are. Land IQ is a woman-owned small business firm here in Sacramento. Myself and my partner started the firm in 2007 with 5 people, and we're about 40 people now, and we've just grown as we needed to grow. People ask me, how do you have a growth plan? I said, no, I react to what agriculture does. And there's been some needs in agriculture, let's put it that way, for understanding what's going on the surface of the ground. Purposefully, we developed our company with 2 main technical disciplines, land-based scientists and spatial scientists. So I am a farm kid from Butte County. My family farms still today. there. One of my brothers runs our family farm, so I'm of the land-based sciences side of things, and our spatial sciences side of the house is comprised of remote sensing scientists and GIS folks. So the best way to say that is we have boots on the ground, but we also look at things from the sky. And both of them are very important in assessing what accuracies we can achieve and determining what the land use is and how that's changing over time. Next slide. About 14 years ago, the Almond Board of California came to us and said, I think I'm a pretty good almond farmer. These are the growers on the board. I think I'm a pretty good almond farmer, but I can't achieve the average yields that are being reported by USDA NASS. And that was USDA NASS is doing the best job they could do with the information they had. So what are the two things in an average yield? Pounds per acre. Where's the dollar sign? The numerator, that's pounds. So that's measured very well because that's weighed. And the denominator is acres. So if you're dividing through by a number that's too small, you're going to overestimate the yield. So the Almond Board had the right hypothesis to say, we think the acreage is too small. And that acreage at that point in time, 12, 13, 14, those years was rapidly increasing. So hard to keep up with anybody doing it. So we started there, and since that time, we've implemented our crop mapping work in the states there, but primarily we work in California. Most of those states are work that we did for the American Pecan Council, where we mapped every pecan orchard in the United States. We've done some mapping in Mexico and also recently in Australia for almonds and pistachios. You can go to the next slide. I talked about this a little bit already. The joke goes, okay, can you map almonds? And we said, we think we can. And they said, okay. We said, let's start with Madera County. So we did the mapping. We handed the map to the growers on the Almond Board of California. They drove around in their trucks and they said, okay, you did pretty well. We think you got lucky. Do it again. So we did it again in 2013. And they said, okay, fine, you proved yourself. Now do the whole state. So we, at that time, got a specialty crop block grant for almonds, walnuts, pistachios, and prunes, those 4 commodity groups, so they could cost share and do the whole state. And about that same time, this small little law went through the state of California called SGMA. And the California Department of Water Resources said, we've got to know what is going on everywhere all the time, because that footprint uses water. So we embarked in 2014 on a big journey in mapping every single field in California. You can go to the next slide. So yes, since 2014, we've been mapping every single agricultural field in California, 2 acres and greater. That is about 9.66 million acres. It represents about 50 plus crop categories. We'll merge lettuces together into lettuces and leafy greens. We'll merge some of the smaller crops in together into what we call miscellaneous truck crops, some of the very chestnuts and hazelnuts. There's a few orchards of those. We'll merge those together in miscellaneous deciduous, et cetera. But for the most part, 97% of the crops are individual crop categories. How do we do this? Again, land-based scientists, boots on the ground, spatial scientists looking at things from the sky. We are heavily driven by ground truthing information. Excuse me. So in 2023, we drove the circumference of the Earth, 23,000 miles back and forth across the state of California at different times and in different places when crops were in the ground. We traversed the Salinas Valley 4 times because the rotation of crops there is more rapid. We traversed Modoc County once. No knock on Modoc County, but that's just reality. And so we capture about 12 to 14% of every field that's out there from public roads. And we have 2 people in the vehicle with iPads and the driver who's a trained agronomist that says almonds left, walnuts right, fallow left, grapes right, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Why do we do that? We do that for 2 reasons. We can then create, if you have 4,000 known orchards of almonds, you can create what's called a digital fingerprint of almonds, which is different than a digital fingerprint of walnuts. Think about walnuts leafing out a month after almonds. So we look at time series analyses. I could go in great detail with this, but trust me on it. And so we use about 75% of that ground truthing data to calibrate, train the remote sensing models. And then the remaining 25% we use to say, close your eyes, you never drove by it, you didn't see it, have the model predict what was there. Yes, but you did drive by it, so what did you predict versus what did you observe? And that's the 97.6%. We get it right 97.6% of the time. When we get it wrong, the 2.4% of the time, we do not confuse almonds for carrots. We will confuse almonds for peaches. But for the use of this data, in one circumstance for DWR, the consumptive use of water of peaches and almonds is very similar. I passed out a handout in front of you that just gives you a who uses the data and for what uses. So there's just a list of people there. So since we've been doing this now a decade, it's our 10-year anniversary of crop mapping in California. It's exciting, and so we're very blessed to have the opportunity to do this work. Next slide. So these next slides are just 4 slides, and these are stolen from DWR because that's who we do the work for, but this is publicly available data online. Anybody can download it free of charge. So in DWR, they have 4 regions, and I just put this slide together for the purpose of kind of showing there's just where the crops are and in what region, how some crops are more dominant than others. So in the northern region, obviously rice is a big crop, and almonds and walnuts, but those are the acreages there. You can go to the next slide. The next slide's the north central region, which encompasses a lot of the wine country over in Napa and Sonoma counties, and some Solano counties, and then of course San Joaquin County, Sacramento County, et cetera, up into Yuba and Sutter counties. And the predominant crop in the north central region of DWR is grapes. And then here we go again with almonds and walnuts. Next slide, please. So this is the granddaddy of them all. This is the south central region, the big one, 6.5 million acres of everything in the San Joaquin Valley, including the Salinas Valley. And so you can see the legend on the top right-hand corner. You can't quite read all, but trust me, those are a bunch of different crops. And then the last slide, unique in itself, is southern region, all the way down to the Mexican and Arizona borders, imperial avocados and citrus on the coast and everything else. And yes, we spend time in beautiful Blythe, California. So anyway, next slide. So I talked about accuracy. That green line on that map is our ground truthing route. We optimize that every year. Think about, how the land use changes. We have to have the right number of data sampling points in different places at different times. So we pay attention to how things have changed historically, where crops may be coming out, where crops may be going in, and where we modify that. You can go to the next slide. This is an accuracy matrix, so it's just a way of showing what I said before. What did we see in independent validation? We don't use those data for calibration versus what did we predict? So it's just an accuracy matrix in that regard. So you can go to the next slide. Okay, this is a slide that shows multi-cropping. So I have a slogan for our crop mapping. I call it all crops everywhere all the time because it is continuous crop mapping. We, yes, cut it at the water year, but we don't really care too much. We just keep going all the time. And there are many crops that span that September 30th, October 1st break date in different places. This is an example of crop on the left of the Salinas Valley and crops on the left, and then the mapping of that same area on the right. And if you'll look in that little box on the right, you can see that there are 3 specific crops of lettuce and leafy greens. So they triple crop that one field 3 times. And we also, and growers in that area and elsewhere in the state, but primarily in the Salinas Valley, will also choose to not plant an entire field. So we'll have a percent cover too. So those all say 100%, but many times we'll see that field, one crop was 50%, the next one was 60, the next one was 20. So now we know And those, one more thing, and those field boundaries are all hand digitized. Those are not parcel boundaries. Those are true footprints of agriculture. We cut out houses, we cut out farm shops, so they're not parcel boundaries, cut out roads and all that. So it is the true cropped footprint in California of every field, 2 acres and greater. So why is that important? I'll get to that in a minute, but it's really important for a lot of reasons. We now know with high accuracy acreage of everything everywhere. We now know over a decade of time how things have changed. When you look backwards, that can kind of help you look forwards, and I'll get into some of that now with the next slide. So yes, our statewide crop mapping is done for the California Department of Water Resources. However, a number of commodity groups, and that's kind of a 2-year time frame, but a number of commodity groups need their specific crop and they need it in season. So they want to make decisions based on acreage. A big example of that is rice. You may remember a couple years ago, this thing called drought happened. There wasn't a lot of water to be distributed out of Lake Shasta. So the west side of the Sacramento Valley was pretty much devoid of rice, roughly 252,000 acres. The year after that, we had this thing called flooding and rain in 2023. Shasta filled up. Price of rice was smoking high because of the previous year. Everybody planted rice, 515,000 acres of rice that year roughly. So rice is an example of a lot of the groups we work for, almonds, walnuts, pistachios, et cetera. Next slide. So because we've been doing this for 10 years, there's a series of slides here. These are mostly permanent crops, so we can do this trend analysis for any crop that we map. We have the acreage for every year and the spatial mapping on the right. Now there's 2 things I want to point out in each of these successive slides. Yes, these are numbers, so that's numerical, that's interesting, but what's even more interesting is the spatial mapping on the right-hand side. So that's a poor map, but you get the idea. That's up and down the whole Central Valley of California. Those are almond orchards. So not only do you know the acreage, but you know where they are. Previous speakers talked about white areas being groundwater only areas, and it's secure water supply, less secure water supply. We see things changing, and they are correct. We see things changing most rapidly in in white areas or groundwater only areas. So this is almond acreage, peaked in, I think that's 2021, and as you've heard and read, when we do this mapping for the Almond Board of California, real time every year, twice a year. And then we also do removals, and we do bearing acreage and non-bearing acreage. How do we do bearing and non-bearing? Well, we do what's called an age analysis on all permanent crops. So if I know that's an almond orchard right now, and I know that digital fingerprint of an almond orchard, I can look backwards in time to where that digital fingerprint changes from an almond orchard to bare ground. Therefore, I know when it was planted, therefore what year it was planted, therefore I know the age of that orchard. Why does age matter? There's a correlation between yield and age, there's a correlation between water consumption and age, there's a correlation to market conditions and age, there's a correlation to being where the young orchards are versus where they're not, where orchards might be coming out. You get the idea. Okay, so this is the trend of almonds. Next slide, please. Shockingly very similar. This is the trend of walnuts. Even a steeper decline. And some of you may know that we provide this information back on almonds. You can stay on this slide, but back on almonds. Although the total acreage of almonds declined, the bearing acreage flatlined. Why is that? That's because you have this lag effect of non-bearing bleeding into bearing, and those were older plantings, but if that's flatlined now, I'm pretty sure that almond acreage, bearing almond acreage next year is gonna probably head down just like the total acreage has. Okay, so that's walnuts. So the big 3, almonds, walnuts, and, drum roll please, pistachios up and to the right. And we don't, and the interesting thing is the non-bearing acreage in pistachios, that's usually 0 to 5 years, is about 1/3 of the total acreage. So I'll let you make your own conclusions on that, and David could probably make a better conclusion on that than I can financially. Sigma is affecting all of these tree crops and all of the crops everywhere, both positively and negatively. I say I've been in agriculture my entire life in California, which is true, with the exception of some graduate work on the East Coast. But I've never seen agriculture as dynamic as it is today. We're talking about acreage and spatial mapping of crops, but we can go on all day about labor and tariffs and credit and everything else, and cost of inputs and all sorts of things. But we'll stick to this topic for now. But it's the most dynamic, and as the land use change, that drives a lot of things too. Next slide, please. Prunes. The prune price right now is actually quite good. And shockingly, this correction that took place in the prune market a few years back has resulted in a reduction in acreage and an increase in price. So we map prunes, and Don Zay at the prune board asks us to do that every couple of years just to kind of keep abreast. But it's shocking when you have less acreage, the price goes up. Okay, next slide. Plums on a downward trend. This is a little different. These are mostly specialty, market and fresh market plums. So you get the idea. Next slide. Apricots. I love apricots. I wish they would stop decreasing in acreage. Okay. Next slide. And this is just some other deciduous, some kind of those specialty crops: pecans, persimmons, figs, hazelnuts, chestnuts. We tease out figs and persimmons, but you get the idea. Some of these specialty crops, if you group them together, really, I call them specialty crops, are up and to the right, which is very interesting to me, that people are looking for alternative types of fruits and nuts that are just all the alternative to maybe almonds, walnuts, pistachios. And the next slide, the one I love the most are dates. Medjool dates, so I could eat those all day. And they are primarily grown in the southeastern desert areas of California and Coachella and elsewhere. But they are up and to the right, and there's been a high demand for dates. So, okay, next slide. The Raisin Administrative Committee came to us and said, this is the opposite of the almond board. They said, we believe we have less acres than what is being reported. And that everybody who's reporting it, and I know I have CDFA's acronym on this slide, is do the best job they can do, but we look at everything everywhere, and so the complete footprint. So yes, indeed, it is a little bit less in acreage, and we're desperate for price increases, right? So this helps them, because we can prove with high accuracies and ground truthing that this is indeed. So from a marketing perspective, this is important for them. Okay, next slide. And here's some other crops, just the most recent acreage. But you can see the crop map on the right-hand side. It's a big lift and important. One thing I'd like to point out here is we also put a boundary around urban. That is not city boundaries. That is just where houses end and something else begins. And for your next dinner party, you can say that the urban footprint in California is a little bit greater than 50% of the ag footprint. When we first started doing this, I thought it would be about 20 or 25% of ag, but it's actually, when you put a boundary around every little town, even my little town of Durham, you add them all up, it's about 50 or more % of the total ag footprint. Next slide. I talked about age. I never dreamt how much people would use permanent crop age. So the color scheme, color ramp, blue is old and red is young. Water use, crop removals and replantings. Of course, the almond industry and the walnut industry are very intent on removals right now and what's happening there, and they want to know that. You also can use this information for yield estimating. So in almonds is a great example. Where I'm from, about 400 to 500 pounds per acre less in yield than in Kern County, and a continuum down the valley of increasing yield. Okay, so we know where all those orchards are, we know how big they are, how many acres there are, and now we know the age, and there's a relationship between age and yield. And we have, I don't have them in this presentation, but we have those graphs as well. So wow, we can get, knowing this information and the spatial component of where you're actually at and what that yield corresponding at a county level is using historic county data, it provides the industry an opportunity to better estimate or predict what the future yield may be. We did this for a little while, and we got within like 2 or 3%, and the growers are like, oh, can't you get better? And I'm like, well, isn't that good enough? And they said, no. So anyway, and then this is this is it. This is a yield forecasting tool that we built for the almond industry that says, and behind it are all the data, right? So this is just a calculator. This is no different than your retirement calculator that you get online and you say, what's my principal? What's my monthly contribution? What's the interest rate I project? This is the same thing, but underneath it is the acreage, age, and location. So just a little calculator we built. Next slide. And then there's other applications of the mapping. We're investigating some research and development right now of getting at what irrigation method is on each field. Why is that important? That's important so that you can understand a reasonable estimate of irrigation efficiency. If you know the irrigation efficiency and you know the consumptive use of that crop, you can get back to a good estimate of extraction or applied water, which gets back to sigma, which avoids having to try to put a meter on every single well on every person's private property, and you can imagine the struggles with that. Next slide. And this is we do a lot of proximity analyses. This is one that was done for the California Fresh Fruit Association, and they had a little issue with E. coli as it related to proximity to confined animal feeding operations. So they wanted to do a risk assessment that says, what on consecutive quarter-mile radii, is my risk? How close are my orchards to that point source? And that was a very valuable piece of information for them to mitigate any future issues. Next slide. And then we do a ton, we do about 3.5 million acres of field-by-field crop consumptive use for SGMA compliance in the green areas of the map on the right-hand side. I won't even go into that now, but that too is ground truth with climatic stations and such. Next slide. And that's it. So I'm happy to answer any questions you might have, as I'm sure David is too.
So how much time do you guys have?
Yeah.
No, really impressive presentations. A lot of really good information from both of you. Really appreciate you guys coming in and doing this with us today. We'll go ahead and open it up to the board for questions. I know, David, I wanted to start with this, if you don't mind. You know, you talked about generation, going away from the higher priced food. How does that affect organic food? I just wondered what the relationship was there.
That's a good one. How much time do you have? Well, in terms of organics, we saw these dynamics over the past 10 to 5 years. Probably the demand for organics was growing faster than the supply of organics, right? Then we had attractive organic price premiums. And then over the past few years, we've seen that the supply of organics is been growing faster than the demand. Or in other words, if you look at the segment of consumers that are hardcore organic consumers, it's probably between 10 and 15% of US consumers, right? And on the other extreme of the spectrum, you have 5 to 10% of consumers that don't believe in organics, put it that way. And in the middle, you have the great majority that they will buy organics if the price is right. So now we're in a way where the 15% of organic demand has been met, and then the increasing demand, increasing supplies of organic is facing a more elastic demand segment or more price sensitive. So that's why we've seen that some pressures on organic price premiums, depending on the commodity that you're discussing, but that's a general trend that the demand for, as I said, the 15% is been met, and now new supplies are going to be facing that different demand segment. I don't know if I answered your question, but.
No, I appreciate that. Joy, I think you were up.
Thank you. Thank you very much. On the land mapping, it feels to me like there's so many other uses.
Yeah.
So we've been talking about pesticide spray, and this would be very valuable information for pinpointing, where the sources are and where the boundaries are. That would be one thing. And then the other thing would be, and this will make everybody on this board laugh, is say, broadband for agriculture. This is essential.
Wow, Joy thought of a way to bring it in.
I cannot help it. But because we want to get connectivity to the farm. So knowing exactly where the crops are and which crops they are is extremely helpful, I would think.
Yeah, I thank you for that softball pitch and a point that I didn't make that I told myself I wanted to make in this. Look, we are the data creators. You all are the data users. I always say this, let your gears turn in your head, Joy, like you just did, and everyone else. The data are there for a decade now. It's really powerful stuff. It's free of charge. It's publicly available. Anybody in the world can use it, and we should be using as much as we can. And I know, that's why I handed out that piece of paper that I did to you that says, here's all the users and the uses. And that's not exhaustive because I can't look into your brains and come up with the ideas that you just came up with. So yeah, we're the creators of the data, and we work hard at that. But I really, really encourage people to think of creative ways to use it, because that's how, you cannot manage what you don't measure, right? So that's really important. So thanks for that softball. I appreciate
Well,
it.
how does someone get access to this?
Your friend on Google, when you say DWR land use, and your DWR will pop up, and it's GIS data files. So you got to have someone that can download those data files and use them and interpret them. And there's a lot of attributes. I didn't even talk about the attributes. Yes, there's crop type, there's acreage, there's age, there's peak dates, which means when the annual crops might be planted versus when they're harvested. So you're talking about shifting during environmental conditions. There's a whole lot of data there it's a huge data set, but it's powerful.
Go ahead.
So I have two things. One, I'm really interested in how this works. You have carbon mapping. And just, we're all looking for a lower cost way of verifying practices that may or may not lead to ecosystem service markets, but it's really becoming increasingly important in USDA is looking at all the data sources and what's best for that. But my other one is going back to my first question to the previous panel. Local government is struggling with land use and the intersection of energy, ag, water, where the job's going to be, what are the community impact trade-offs. And they don't have a lot of resources. Is this precise enough and useful enough for them in trying to map out? That's assuming that they have the opportunity, and it doesn't just happen on its own, to map out strategically where solar's best placed here, it's compatible use with XYZ.
Yeah. So you have a map of all the ag fields in the state. There's other spatial data too. There's irrigation district boundaries. That gives you an idea of water supply. You can look at political boundaries. You overlay that. We've been asked many times, how many acres are grown in my assembly district of X crop?
Yeah.
Okay, for sure, no problem. We can tell you that. So whatever spatial data, you have city boundaries, you have soil type, you have environmental, min-max temperature, growing degree days, frost-free days, et cetera. There's all sorts of different spatial data layers that you lay on top of that or that on top of that and come to conclusions by kind of mining those data. Looking backwards in time at acreage and seeing where things are changing more. I already mentioned things are changing more in white areas, groundwater-only areas, obviously. Removals are occurring faster there. Some areas are actually increasing in tree crop, where you might think northern and where there's more secure water supply. Back to your carbon question, the carbon component on that list is intended to say, we know the age of every orchard, we know how much wood is in that orchard,
Carbon, okay.
and we know the acreage of that orchard, and the other researchers can tell you the carbon content of an almond orchard, or almond tree versus the carbon content of a prune tree versus the carbon content of a walnut tree, et cetera, you know what's standing there, because if you get the acreage and age right, that's another component to eliminating that variability in those estimates.
Thanks. And then I have a question for David, because I don't think we've spent nearly enough time talking about diminishing profitability, which for some audiences is a dirty word, but it's the only way to maintain viability in agriculture. And if you have, what has been mentioned, several crops have had back-to-back less than cost of production, and hopefully in good times, there's a big fat savings account somewhere, but not always. And so when do you start to see the equity starting to be tapped into, or loss of equity is going to change your decision just to get down to the down and dirty, that's the question on everybody's minds.
Like what? Like lending decisions, things like that?
Like where is that starting to impact? Does it go back to water security that it really impacts operation lending? If you're starting to see equity diminish too fast? What's the forecast? Because you're showing some optimism at this cycle, but I'm not sure how many years that's going to take for that cycle to come back.
Yeah. In my defense, I gotta say that I'm not a banker. I'm an industry analyst, so I don't
Now
make.
we know why you're
I don't make decisions on credit, on things like that. But definitely, they pay attention to water security for profitability, and also like land values, things like that. It's been quite challenging for some industries over the past 2-3 years. But now we've seen for some big industries, things are turning around, and still below break even for many, but things are moving in the right direction. So hopefully we achieve some profitability in some of these large tree nut industries, for example, starting hopefully this year or next season again. So a lot of moving pieces as always, but and the cost of money is one of them. We know that everybody wants like lower interest rates, and that is not coming soon enough. But a lot of moving pieces, and I don't really know the answer to that, given that I don't make decisions on credit and things like that. So.
But David, we've seen farm equipment operators making large layoffs. With my feeling when I see that is they're not anticipating farm income to be increasing anytime quickly. So I'm sure they're talking to their prognosticators and looking at trends as well. So are you feeling this is a shorter term or a longer term condition in agriculture? And that's in general, not necessarily California.
Yeah. Again, it's challenging to say, given like we have a lot of unknowns, right? So given the elections and what potential policies are going to be implemented. So really hard to tell is like when I said like, yeah, economists, like they say, they've been predicting that a recession is going to happen. And to this end, I gotta say, do you know the definition of an economist? Yeah, it's an individual that spends 50% of his time predicting what's going to happen, and the other 50% explaining why it didn't happen. So at this point, I'm not even making my first 50%. So probably you gotta invite me back to at least do the other 50%.
No, I appreciate that. I know that agriculture is not very predictive because of so many events and pressures that we see. So Thank you, I appreciate that.
If you include weather and water in the equation, yeah, that even gets more complicated, so.
And Joel, I had a question for you on, when you're doing Land IQ, when you're doing your data collection on trees in particular, I mean, it seems like a lot of these guys are not, I mean, they're abandoning orchards, but they're not pulling them out. How do you get that in the program?
Here again, the almond board, they're never satisfied, these growers. First they said, map it again, map the state. Then they said, we want to know the age. Then this started happening, all joking aside. And they said, we know, and you just described it, that growers are walking away from orchards. It's happening in the vineyard industry too, and walnuts and a few other tree crops too. So remember I talked about creating that digital fingerprint of an almond orchard. That is a digital fingerprint of an almond orchard. So we can tell you it's a standing almond orchard. Then we created a different digital fingerprint of a stressed almond orchard and of an abandoned almond orchard. Those digital fingerprints look different. And then we ground truth that to make sure that that is indeed what is occurring. So the Almond Board of California about 2 years, maybe 3 years ago now, said, add to your scope of work abandoned. Because it's not producing, they're not going to harvest it, so it doesn't contribute to the volume of the crop they have to market. And then add to your list stressed, so something in between abandoned and fully irrigated. And that's a little bit grayer area, and there's a whole timing component of that, is when you look at these images, and we look at an image every 6 days, and when you look at these images and knowing the phenological growth cycle of each of those types of crops, when that blinks the most, when it shows up. So we know kind of when to look for those things. So that's what we do now for them, and also now walnuts. And that just refines what they're dealing with. And then you overlay GSA, GSP, all that. You can go on, and I could go on and on about where those abandoned ones are, stressed ones are. Now with the drought, or with the 2023 rains and this last year, everything looks pretty good again for the time being, right? But it absolutely was stuck out like a sore thumb back in 21, 22, water years.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I mean, I've seen plenty of them out there that, well, even some that I thought were abandoned coming back in for a year, and
Yeah.
because they didn't die last year or the year before rather. But one other thing, when you talk about water consumption, does that vary from the north to the south? Do you calculate? Or I guess that's maybe a DWR question, but
No, we do that work too, like I said, on about a little over 3 million acres, but mostly in Kern, Kings, Tulare, southwestern Fresno County, a little bit in Madera, a little bit in Stanislaus, for some GSAs that want to use ET as their compliance mechanism. So that's ground truth. We have about 85 stations that are calibrate our models, again, all ground truth stuff. To answer your question, yes, it's hotter, drier in the South Valley than it is in the North Valley. Take out the precipitation, but you get more precipitation in the North Valley than you do in the South Valley.
Right.
So it's kind of a wash, but if you take out the precipitation, the applied water and the consumption of applied water is greater, obviously, in the South Valley than in the North.
all right. Doria.
So just a quick question came up because I serve on the Land Equity Task Force, and I just wondered if you collected or overlaid any farmer demographics or land holding and ownership status on the maps.
We have not, but that can be done if those maps exist.
I don't think they
We are doing a project right now, trying to identify small farmers. And so one of the things that is a trigger for small farmers is small acreage. And so we look at those small acreage areas, and that doesn't necessarily mean they're small farmers. It could be a corporation that owns a bunch of little small acreages. So that we're trying to tease that out too with looking at ownership data. So, yeah.
And then how do you, I guess you get contracts from different organizations, companies, in order to expand kind of the data sets that you have? Is that's how you work?
Some entities have their own GIS staff that can interpret the data, and some people don't, and we'll do that interpretation for them if they prefer.
Thank you.
Any other questions from the board? Could you check online for us, Josh?
Yes, if you'd like to make public comment on this agenda item, please use your hand icon and I can unmute your line. I'm seeing no public comment at this time.
All right. I'd like to thank both of you for coming in. Fascinating reports. Love to have you back in the future sometime. We'll see how your predictions work out, David.
All right.
Thank you again. All right. At this time, we're going to go ahead and take a break. Be back 1 o'clock? Yep. All right. 1 o'clock. We'll be back for the remainder of our meeting. Thank you for joining us, those of you here and online.